What is up guys, Fire here, and today we're going to be breaking down the huge patch that is 4.13. So this patch is quite big because worlds are around the corner, so they're going to be doing a lot of kind of tweaks and changes to bring the balance in for the competitive side ready for when the world championships are. Now because this is such a big patch, I've broken this down into the categories that they have, so fighters, mages, assassins, marksmen, supports and items. And you can see on the screen now, if you just want to look at a couple of them, you can click on them right now and it will take you to that section. So let's jump right into fighters to start with, and this is going to be junglers and also top laners as well. So what they're doing to Elise is actually quite smart. They're basically making it harder for players who aren't as good at Elise, but they're also keeping it just as strong for players who are good at Elise. Now what I mean by this really is the missile width is going down on Cocoon, which means it's harder to hit, and also repel, the range is getting reduced. So if you're not as good at Elise and you've just picked her because she's one of the best, then you're probably not going to do as well because it's going to be harder to hit your skill shots and you're going to have to be sneakier to get in range to use your E. Now if you're a good Elise though, this isn't really going to matter too much. Obviously you are going to miss some cocoons that you would have hit before, but in general they aren't toning down her damage or her clear speed, which are the important things. So moving on to another jungler who's one of the top tier, and that's going to be Evelyn, and these changes are also really smart. So right now Eve has two kind of routes. She can either go as a tank or as a damage source, and she can kind of mix and match to kind of do both, which is what they're changing here. So they're reducing her base damage, but they're increasing the ratios on her Q, which means that late game you'll still be doing more probably damage if you build full damage, but if you build tank then you won't be doing as much. This is really just forcing you to choose, okay, do I want to be a tank for my team or do I want to be a damage source? Because before she could build tank and still kill you, and now you're probably going to have to build damage if you want to solo out a carry. Next up we have Gragas, and this isn't really going to affect support Gragas as much as it's going to affect top lane and also jungle Gragas. So jungle Gragas is probably screwed because now the Q does 70% damage to minions instead of 100%, so his clear speed is going to be way down, especially early. Introducing a mana cost onto Drunken Rage is good just for trading, because at the moment you could go top, you could use your W whenever you like, you can trade with it, and it'll also obviously give you some health back as well. Giving it a mana cost means that you have to be a little bit more careful, and it just kind of introduces a little more counterplay to Gragas, so he's not going to be as strong as before. So this Hecarim change is only a minor buff really. You don't really build movement speed on Hecarim, so the passive isn't too useful anyway, and the bigger thing here is that they're reducing the mana cost on his Q. It's not really a huge change because they're reducing the mana cost late game, and late game you don't really have mana issues, so it's not really going to be too effective anyway. This Jax change is very minor. I actually have played Jax since the patch and I don't really notice much of a difference, but supposedly it's going to allow you to CS a little bit easier without really adjusting his power too much. So one of the bigger changes is to Lee Sin, and the general and the safeguard changes you can see kind of somewhat cancel each other out because he's got more health regen, so he doesn't need that shield for as long. But obviously the shield duration being halved is actually pretty big, especially when you're fighting just from AoE in a team fight. The bigger change is his cripple. Now, you guys probably don't realize that you're actually reducing the attack speed. You don't really think about it, I guess, but late game, this is a really big thing. In a team fight, when you hit your E, just probably to slow really, that's the reason you're doing it. But as a side effect, you're actually slowing everyone's attack speed. And now that you aren't doing that anymore, this is actually going to be pretty big for his late game. Okay, so Olaf buffs, I don't really know what to say about this because this is not enough to get him suddenly back into competitive. The undertow cooldown is nice, but honestly, you don't really rely on the cooldown because you pick it up and you throw it again. If you don't pick up the axe, then the enemy's going to escape. So the cooldown doesn't really do much for you anyway. His W and R changes are nice, but honestly, I don't really think this is going to be enough to bring him back into any kind of competitive play. So this Shyvana change is a very minor nerf, and obviously actually these guys have said it's kind of a bug fix, but basically it just means when you're standing on her flame trail in her dragon form, you're not going to be taking as much damage as you would before. So next up we have mages and assassins, and there are actually a few changes in here which are pretty big. Now first of all we're going to be looking at Kayle, and basically her E scales slightly better with items, and her intervention, her ultimate, is going to have a lower cooldown. Though this doesn't really affect her too much because it's just bringing down some of the nerfs from the last patch, but it does mean that if you are good with Kayle and you enjoy playing her, then it's going to be a little bit more viable to play her. Now this LeBlanc change is okay, it's not actually as bad as it looks because you do tend to max your W first for wave clear, and it's also the highest damage as well. So you are going to use the lower mana cost at higher ranks, but it's not really going to fix too much. It's more just a quality of life change than anything else. Now this Lissandra change is actually a little bit bigger than you're probably thinking. It's a really good buff for her and you'll probably be seeing her in some of your games now. So her Q is her main source of damage, and that's her main poking tool in lane. It's her main kind of sustained damage in a team fight. Now because you max this first, you are going to be using the cooldown reduction at later ranks. So it's down to 3 seconds now. With some CDR, you'll probably be close to 40%. That'll be under 2 seconds. And if you think about it, having something under 2 seconds that you can spam that does a lot of damage that you're maxing is a really good damage buff for her in team fights. Now the Ring of Frost AP ratio going down isn't really that big a deal because when you combine it with the fact that her Q is now going to be outputting damage more often, it actually more than makes up for it. The Frozen Tomb, the ultimate change, is also really good because if you look at it, the rank 3 ultimate has basically doubled, and that's really going to be huge. So you'll notice that you'll see a lot more Lissandras now because she was already quite good, and this has kind of probably tipped her over the edge. So these Lulu changes are actually quite minor. It's going to affect top and mid Lulu more than anything else because you don't really build as much AP on supports anyway. The biggest thing to note probably here is the Whimsy, and even that's not too big because you don't tend to max that. You tend to max that last, and so the reduced mana isn't really going to affect it, and I don't think you'd ever max it over Q for the damage and the slow or over your E for the shield, and so it's kind of one of those things where it's not really going to have too much of an impact. Now moving on from something that was very minor to a very big buff, this is actually really huge and you're going to notice a lot more Luxes in your games. Now I main Lux in season 2 I think, and I love this champion. I've played her a lot over the past couple of days and I really love how much damage she can do now. Now there are two things. So yes, it's her passive which you proc with your auto attacks, right? So it's going to make you a little bit stronger in the lane phase, but the other thing is that your ultimate procs this. So if you get an E across the enemy team, right, you then put your passive onto them, you then lay your ultimate over everyone, and suddenly you're going to be doing a bunch more damage than you were doing before, so it makes her even more deadly. So according to Riot, these changes to Vel'Koz are more bug fixes than buffs because, well, I guess they are buffs because they're increasing the range and the width, but this is just to match actually how they looked visually on the screen. Yasuo has been getting hit with the nerf bat over and over and over, and eventually they're just going to smack him into the ground where he's not played anymore, but I don't really think this is going to be the patch that does it. The biggest thing here is his shield duration is down to a second. That's actually going to hurt him in lane quite a lot because it means you can harass him quicker and you can poke him down, because at the moment he kind of has his shield, you kind of poke him, he just runs around, he hits you, he runs away. Whereas now it's going to be easier for him to kind of CS a little bit, take the shield off him, and then you're going to punish him for it. So this Ziggs change is actually really big. It might not seem like it because it's just changing the cooldown the same at every rank, but 120 seconds is really high for an ultimate, and it means that if you use your ultimate to clear a wave, you will not have it for the team fight that comes after. 2 minutes, to put it in perspective, is half the time the Baron buff is on. If you think about that whole time, that's actually quite long, right? You think about it, I've got Baron for quite a while. Well, half of that time, Ziggs won't have his ultimate if he uses it at the start. So that's actually going to be really huge, and it's going to mean that it's easier to push against him, really, and it's kind of less punishing mid-game as well. Okay, so moving on to AD carry changes. I don't care, Riot, you're never gonna make me call him a marksman. It just doesn't sound right. First up, we have Graves, and if you follow me for a while, you'll know that I absolutely love playing Graves, and these changes are making him get back into being viable, I guess, but they're not really tipping him over the edge. So his buckshot damage is pretty good because if you E into someone and you Q, then you're going to be doing 15% more. You're doing 5% for each bullet. Obviously, you can hit them with all three if you're right next to them, and that change in that regard is actually pretty good. The R change is more aimed at his late game, and this doesn't really make too much sense because by the time you're level 16, an extra 100 damage on your ultimate isn't really going to do too much at all. I mean, even at level 11, you're going to get an extra 50 damage, and that's not really going to do too much. So his ultimate change is not going to be as big as his Q change. Okay, so moving on to Jinx change, and this has just boggled my mind. Like, it may not look like much, and you may have even skipped over it because you think, oh, that doesn't really matter. It happens with towers anyway, but in my opinion, this is tipping her over the edge. So with the current meta and just how the game is, inhibs are really important. That's probably the way that you win the game. If you get the first inhib, it's very difficult to come back in a game. Now, what this is doing is basically meaning that she has a huge range with her Q anyway, so that's kind of low risk to attack an inhib, and then she can do it and then run away straight away, so she's not even punished for it. At the moment, we see this with towers. Like, Jinx will come up, she'll probably take a little bit of a risk to take the tower because she knows that she gets the speed buff and can run away. Now in this kind of play as well, it means that she can attack it from a higher range and do the exact same, and I just feel like it's not really a needed buff and it kind of is a bit too far. Okay, so Kog'Maw nerfs, this is definitely warranted. He's been one of the best ADs for a while, and the reason for it is because he's very strong in lane. He has a dip in the mid game, but that's kind of made up for Triforce, and then he has a very good late game as well. So as you can probably tell from what I said, Kog'Maw doesn't really have a weak point in the game, and so that's kind of where they're trying to address now. They're reducing his base health by 40, and it may not sound a lot, but level 1 this is actually going to be pretty huge. They're also reducing the armor and magic resistance shred on his Q, and if you think about it, you actually max this normally second because the attack speed passive and this, and so it's aimed at basically making him less of a lane bully rather than making him less of a tank killer. So it's still a good change, it's just reducing his early power. Right, so we have some Lucian nerfs, and this time they actually are nerfs, so don't worry guys, it's going to bring his power down a little bit. These changes aren't really that huge, but the biggest reason they're changing it is because now that your Light Singer, your passive, reduces the cooldown of your E and makes you jump a lot, it basically meant that he was immune to slows. Like, every time you put a slow on him, 2 seconds later he would cancel it, and that's kind of just a little bit overpowered. So they're removing that, they're increasing the cooldown to make him dash a little bit less, and it does bring his power down a little, but he's still going to be top tier. So this Sivir change is aimed more at competitive in my mind than solo queue, because one, Sivir's not paid in solo queue because she's kind of a utility AD rather than a carry AD, and carry ADs are all the flavor at the moment. The other thing is that you need to use her ultimate in an organized way, and solo queue is definitely not organized. So they're basically just increasing the initial movement speed at later ranks, and they're going to make it a little easier to engage or disengage, whichever you want to do in the late game. Now this Tristana change is really big, and it's actually going to hurt her early lane phase quite a lot. So right now she had this no risk way of trading, and for those of you who have followed me for a while again, you'll know that trading is what I say is the most important part of playing AD, and that's how you win games. Now her trading potential is way down because 30 less damage level 1 is actually huge. If you think, people probably start with about 600 health, I'd say level 1. So say if you use your E 3 times on an enemy, then that's going to be 90 damage that you've actually lost because they're taking away 30 from each shot. So 100 damage taken away from someone who only has 600 to 700 health is actually quite a big chunk that you're now not doing. So it is going to take her down a notch, especially in lane, and it'll mean that you can bully and trade with her a little bit better. But remember that the reason she's picked mostly is because she resets with a W, so she snowballs really hard. She has obviously her range, her disengage, her jump, and also she fits in the current meta of AD items very well. So you'll still be able to play her, you'll just be down a notch. So Vayne changes, oh my god, my two favourite champions, Vayne and Graves, both getting buffed in one patch. I'm so happy, it's unreal. So her buff is actually quite big for late game, but it doesn't fix her lane phase problems, and that's the biggest problem she has right now. They're giving her more attack speed per level, which means that late game she'll be able to attack faster and she'll hit that attack speed cap quicker. But they're also changing her ultimate to give her more AD, and it's specifically more AD late game. So basically they are making Vayne way more of a threat late game, and they're kind of making it, I guess without changing her early game, they're making it so that it's okay to fall behind because you'll know that it's worth it because you're going to be so strong late game. So moving on to support, and I'm not going to go over Sona just now because I want to do a separate video like a preview and how you should play her now. So the first one we're going to look at is going to be Braum, and what do you know, they're going to nerf him again. Now the thing is, and what I always say, is that Braum's kit is the reason that he's going to be picked all the time, because he has a slow, a stun, a knock up, a jump, a shield. Like, you can't really get more utility and a more perfect kit on a support than Braum. What they are doing is they're toning down his damage, they're making his W cost more, and they're also kind of just tweaking his ultimate. So they're making it that the knockup doesn't last as long and the slow is going to scale instead of just being a flat 60%. Now these are all nice changes and they're going to go some way to fixing it, but the reason he is so strong is because you snowball as a support on Braum really hard. If you get ahead in lane, then you can probably 1v1 the enemy AD, and that's not because of his damage or anything like this patch's hitting, it's because he's so freaking tanky. Like, he just doesn't die. I'm not really going to go over the Janna changes because I don't think they are big enough to warrant going over. I think they're nice little changes, but it's not really going to affect anything. Whereas this Nami change is something that I expected, but it's not what I actually thought they were going to change. So what they're actually doing to her is basically just making her heal a higher cooldown, and like, this isn't really going to affect that much. Like, Nami is so good because of her heal, her sustain, she doesn't have mana problems, and she has a great kit, and this doesn't really target any of them. So Nami is definitely still going to be one of the top supports. So moving on to Thresh, and he's probably actually the person that most of you have asked me if he's still going to be able to be played, and it seems like everyone's worried that he's suddenly going to be not viable anymore. The W change is going to affect him in team fights way more than anything else. Like, if you think about it, you use your shield really as the shield part in a team fight, whereas in lane phase, you're only really shielding one person anyway. The biggest change here is going to be obviously the box, and the reason that they're changing this is because it's just way too strong in a 2v2 fight. So if you put your box down and you hook someone, you can actually tug them into one wall and then you can flay them into another. And then if they try and escape, they're probably going to have to eat one more. So that's 3 walls that someone potentially is going to eat to escape you. Now, taking 3 walls of damage in a 2v2 fight bot lane is just way too strong. I mean, it'll turn the tables from a fight that you probably will lose into one that you'll win. So that's why they're changing it. Honestly, I think that's warranted. I think it's been kind of coming for a while. Okay, so that wraps up my patch analysis for 4.13, and I apologize, this was a long video, but obviously there were a ton of changes and I didn't really want to skip over anything. I wanted to cover everything for you guys, which is why I said feel free to skip to other kind of things. Now, I'm not going to go over the items today because 1, very long video anyway, and 2, I'm going to do a video on DFG and Banshees, which is going to be separate, coming later this week anyway, because I think those changes actually affect a lot more than you think. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in my next video.